He told me never to come back to that house. 3 years later, I stood on his porch anyway, soaked to the bone, holding a letter I never sent and a secret I never told him. I thought I was walking into an apology. I didn't know I was walking into a storm that would trap us together for 3 days. In a house full of locked rooms, unspoken names, and a truth neither of us was ready to survive. By the time the power went out and the roads disappeared underwater, it wasn't the weather that scared me anymore. It was him. The way he looked at me like he'd been waiting, and the way he flinched every time I reached for his hand. Something happened in that house after I left. Something he never told anyone. And that night, with nowhere left to run, he finally told me. But what happened next changed my life forever. The road to Ashcombe Hollow had not changed in 3 years, though everything else about Elias Marsh had. He noticed this as he drove past the leaning fence posts and the crooked mailbox that still read Whitlock in fading paint. A name that belonged to a man who no longer opened that door for anyone. Elias was 31 now, a structural engineer who had spent the last 3 years building bridges in cities that never once felt like home. Precisely because home was a 2-story farmhouse at the edge of a pine forest, and home had a name, Julian Whitlock. The sky over the valley had the color of a healing bruise, greenish-gray and swollen, and the radio in Elias's truck kept interrupting the music with a flat, mechanical voice warning of a storm system stalling over the county. He should have turned around. Instead, he gripped the letter on the passenger seat, the one he'd written and rewritten 11 times and never mailed, and kept driving, because some apologies could not be trusted to paper. Some apologies needed a face, a voice, the terrifying vulnerability of standing in front of a person and hoping they wouldn't close the door. Julian was 33, and he had rebuilt his life around silence. He ran a small woodworking shop out of the barn behind the house, crafting furniture with the same careful, deliberate hands that used to trace the line of Elias's jaw in the dark. He had told everyone in town that Elias moved away for work. He had never told anyone the truth, that he was the one who asked him to leave, and that the asking had nearly destroyed him. When the truck pulled into the gravel drive, Julian was standing in the doorway of the barn with a plane in one hand and sawdust on his forearms, and for a moment neither man moved, as if the air between them had turned to glass. The first drops of rain had already started, fat and slow, striking the tin roof like the countdown to something neither of them could stop. "You shouldn't be here," Julian said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that betrayed every year of practiced composure. "I know," Elias said. "I came anyway." The wind picked up before either of them could say anything else, howling down from the ridge with a suddenness that made the pines bend and groan. And within minutes the storm the radio had warned about arrived, not as a suggestion but as a verdict. Julian shouted for Elias to get inside, and they ran together across the yard, rain needling their skin, thunder cracking so close it seemed to split the sky directly above the house. Inside, the farmhouse smelled the way Elias remembered. Cedar and coffee and the particular quiet of a house where a man lived alone by choice. Julian lit the lanterns before the power failed, because he always lit the lanterns before the power failed. Some habits from their years together had never left him, even after he'd tried so hard to leave everything else behind. When the lights finally died with a soft electrical sigh, the two of them stood in the lantern glow like strangers wearing familiar faces. "Why are you here, Elias?" Julian asked, setting the lantern on the kitchen table with more force than necessary. "Because I never got to ask you why," Elias said. 3 years, Julian. You never gave me a reason. You just told me to leave and I left, because I loved you enough to respect that. Even when it broke something in me I still haven't fixed." Julian's jaw tightened, and outside the rain intensified into something that sounded less like weather and more like an accusation. "Some reasons aren't kind enough to say out loud." "Try me," Elias said. "I drove 400 miles into a storm. I think I've earned the truth." But Julian only shook his head and turned toward the window, watching the yard vanish beneath sheets of rain, and Elias understood, with the particular ache of a man who had loved this house and this person longer than he'd loved anything else, that tonight would not surrender its secrets easily. The storm did not relent. By 10 o'clock, the creek at the bottom of the property had swallowed the footbridge whole, and the single road out of Ashcombe Hollow had become an impassable river, a fact confirmed when Julian's cell phone showed no signal and the landline produced only static. They were trapped. Not metaphorically, not romantically, but literally and completely trapped in a farmhouse together with no way out and no way to pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened. Elias remembered, standing in that kitchen, the first winter storm he and Julian had ever weathered together, for years earlier, when the house still smelled of fresh paint instead of memory. Back then Julian had been a different kind of quiet. Not the guarded silence of a man protecting a wound, but the comfortable silence of a man who had simply never needed many words to feel understood. He used to hum while he worked, an old tune with no name that Elias had never managed to place, and sometimes late at night, he would talk about the house he wanted to build someday, out past the tree line, with windows facing east so the two of them could wake up to the sun instead of an alarm clock. Elias had believed, with the particular certainty of a man newly and completely in love, that they had all the time in the world to build it. That certainty had been the first thing Julian's silence took from him. In the years since, Elias had learned to be careful with his hope, to measure it the way he measured load-bearing capacity on a bridge design, always accounting for the possibility of collapse. Standing now in the same kitchen, watching Julian's hands shake slightly around a coffee mug, Elias understood that the careful, guarded man in front of him was not a stranger but a casualty, of grief, of fear, of a father who had turned love into a liability. "You still hum when you're nervous," Elias said, watching Julian's fingers drum an unconscious rhythm against the counter. Julian looked up, startled. "I didn't realize I still did that." "You do. Same tune. You never told me what it was." "My mother used to sing it," Julian said quietly, and something flickered across his face, quick and painful, gone before Elias could fully read it. "She died when I was 9. My father never let anyone mention her name after that. Like grief was a weakness he couldn't afford to have in his house. I think that's the first thing he ever taught me. That love, once it's gone, isn't supposed to be spoken of again. I think that's the lesson I applied to you without ever meaning to." Elias felt the shape of a whole childhood rearrange itself in his understanding. The silences, the guardedness, the way Julian had always flinched slightly whenever Elias said the words "I love you" too easily, as if the ease itself were dangerous. "You were 9 years old," Elias said gently. "You didn't choose that lesson. It was given to you." "Doesn't make it any less mine to unlearn," Julian said. The wind screamed against the house with a ferocity that rattled the window panes, and somewhere beyond the kitchen a shutter tore loose and slammed against the siding in a frantic, arrhythmic percussion. Julian moved instinctively toward the sound, and Elias followed, and together they secured the shutter in the driving rain, soaked through in seconds, shouting instructions to each other over the howl of the wind, the old partnership between them resurfacing with an ease that neither had expected. Back inside, dripping onto the kitchen floor, they laughed. A startled, disbelieving laugh, the kind that arrives uninvited in the middle of chaos, and for a moment 3 years disappeared entirely, replaced by the simple, physical fact of two men who still knew how to move through a crisis together without a single wasted word. Julian made coffee on the wood stove because the electric kettle was useless, and the domestic familiarity of it, the way he still remembered exactly how Elias liked his coffee, black with a single sugar cube, undid something in both of them. Elias watched him move through the kitchen with the same economy of motion he'd always had, and felt the old ache return, sharp and undiminished by distance. "Do you remember the night we fixed the roof?" Elias asked, if only to fill a silence that had grown too heavy. Julian almost smiled. "You fell off the ladder trying to impress me. I broke my wrist trying to impress you. You didn't tell your brother it was because of me." "My brother didn't need to know that," Elias said quietly, "that I would break bones for you and call it an accident." Julian set the coffee down harder than he meant to. "That's exactly the problem, Elias. You gave me everything and never asked for anything back. And I let you because I was a coward, and cowards take what's offered without ever explaining why they can't offer the same." The confession hung in the lantern-lit kitchen like smoke that refused to clear. Elias felt his pulse in his throat. "Explain it now." Julian's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. "My father called me the week before I asked you to leave. He'd found out about us. Someone in town told him, some good Samaritan who thought he deserved to know his son was ruining the family name. He said if I didn't end it, he would make sure everyone here knew, would make sure my shop failed, would make sure I had nothing left. I believed him because he'd already spent 30 years proving he was capable of that kind of cruelty. Elias felt something in his chest crack open, old anger and old grief colliding. You never told me any of that. You just said it was over. Because if I told you the truth, you would have stayed and fought for me, and he would have destroyed you along with me. I couldn't let that happen. I'd rather you hate me and be safe than love me and be ruined. The rain lashed the windows as if the storm itself objected to the confession, and for a long moment neither man spoke, the weight of 3 lost years settling between them like sediment finally allowed to sink. Your father, Elias said carefully, is he still? He died 8 months ago, Julian said, his voice flat with an old, exhausted grief. Heart attack. I went to the funeral and felt nothing but relief, and then I hated myself for feeling relief, and then I realized the only person I wanted to tell any of that to was you, and I had no right to call you after everything I'd done. You could have called, Elias said. I would have come. I know, Julian said. That's exactly why I didn't. Something in Elias broke loose at that. Not anger, but a fierce, aching tenderness. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and did not touch Julian, only stood close enough that their breathing synchronized, close enough that the old current between them sparked back to life despite 3 years of deliberate distance. I need you to understand something, Elias said. I didn't come back tonight to make you feel guilty. I came back because I never stopped loving you, and I was tired of building bridges in cities where nobody knew my name, when the only place I've ever wanted to be known is right here, with you. Julian's composure finally cracked, and something in his face, the careful architecture he'd built over 3 years to keep himself from feeling this exact thing, collapsed entirely. I don't deserve you walking back into a storm for me. Let me decide what I deserve to walk into, Elias said. The lantern flickered as thunder rolled directly overhead, and the house shuddered with a violence that reminded them both how precarious their shelter truly was. A tree somewhere on the property gave way with a crack like a rifle shot, and Julian flinched instinctively toward the sound, an old reflex from childhood storms spent bracing against his father's temper as much as the weather. Elias, without thinking, reached out and steadied him, one hand on his shoulder, and Julian did not pull away. There's something else, Julian said, his voice barely above the storm. Something I've never told anyone, not even my father, not even you. Elias waited, and the waiting itself felt like an act of love, the willingness to stand in the dark with someone and let them arrive at their own truth in their own time. When you left, Julian continued, I didn't just lose you. I lost the version of myself that believed he deserved good things. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but really I think I was punishing myself because some part of me believed my father was right, that men like us weren't allowed happiness, and the safest thing was to make sure I never had any to lose. The confession landed with the force of the storm itself, and Elias felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness alone but from the terrible recognition of watching someone he loved dismantle his own worth so thoroughly and so quietly that no one had noticed, including, for 3 years, Elias himself. You were never the problem, Julian. Your father's cruelty was never a verdict on who you are. It was only ever a reflection of who he was. I'm trying to believe that, Julian whispered. I'm trying. They sat together on the kitchen floor as the storm raged outside, backs against the cabinets, shoulders touching, and talked through the night in the fractured, honest way that only becomes possible when 2 people have nothing left to lose and no way to leave the room. Julian spoke of the years of silence he'd built around himself, the shop he'd poured his grief into, the way he'd catalogued every piece of furniture he built as a kind of penance. Elias spoke of the cities he'd lived in, the bridges he'd designed, the way he'd measured every structure's ability to bear weight and thought, privately, obsessively, about what it might have looked like to build a life instead of a bridge, and to build it with Julian. It was during a lull in the storm, somewhere near 2 in the morning, that Julian went looking for extra blankets in the hall closet and returned instead with a shoebox he hadn't opened in 8 months, ever since the day he'd cleared out his father's house after the funeral. His hands were unsteady as he set it on the kitchen table, and Elias understood, from the careful, almost reverent way Julian touched the lid, that whatever was inside carried weight far beyond cardboard and paper. I found this the week after he died, Julian said. I never opened it. I told myself I would, eventually, when I was ready. I don't think I've ever been ready for anything in my life. Inside, beneath a folded wool sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco, was a stack of letters, none of them ever sent, each addressed in a cramped, defensive hand to my son. Julian's breath caught as he lifted the first one, and Elias watched something in his face brace itself, the way a man braces before touching a live wire. The letter, dated less than a year before his father's death, did not contain the cruelty either of them expected. It contained, instead, a confession, clumsy, incomplete, written by a man who had never learned the language of apology and was attempting it for the first time at the end of his life. Julian's father wrote that he had driven away the only thing that ever made his son laugh the way his late wife used to laugh, that he had done it out of fear disguised as principle, and that he did not know how to undo it and doubted he deserved to. He had written, near the bottom of the page, in handwriting that grew smaller and more uncertain, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you found a way to keep him, wherever you both are now." Julian read the words twice, his hands trembling, and then set the letter down as though it had burned him. He knew, Julian said, his voice cracking apart entirely. He knew he destroyed us, and he never once told me. I sat with him in the hospital for 2 weeks before he died, and he never said a word of this. He let me believe I'd made the choice alone. Elias reached for Julian's hand and did not let go this time, and Julian did not pull away. Maybe he didn't know how, Elias said gently. Cruelty doesn't always come with an instruction manual for repair. Some men spend their whole lives learning to tear things down and never learn the tools to build them back. That doesn't fix what he took from us, Julian said, tears finally breaking loose. The first Elias had seen him shed since the day they'd said goodbye 3 years earlier. No, Elias agreed. But it means you were never wrong to love me. Even he knew that, in the end, he just couldn't say it while it still might have mattered. Beneath the letters, at the bottom of the shoebox, Julian found a second surprise. A folded document, official and stiff, that made his face pale even in the dim lantern light. It was a copy of his father's will, amended only 4 months before his death, and it named, alongside Julian, a second beneficiary neither of them expected. A nephew named Peter Whitlock, a young man Julian's father had barely spoken to in a decade, who lived 2 counties over and had, according to the document, been quietly promised half the family land, including the very acreage the barn workshop stood on. He never told me this, Julian said, reading the document twice as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Peter's been asking for a meeting about the property for months. I thought it was about condolences. I didn't know he already had a legal claim to half my shop. Elias felt the floor shift beneath the fragile piece they'd just built. What does that mean for you? For the business? It means, Julian said, setting the document down with visibly shaking hands, that I might lose the barn, the land I've poured 8 years into, everything I built out of the wreckage my father left behind, to a cousin who never once visited this house while my father was alive, and who I doubt even remembers my mother's name. He laughed. A short, bitter sound with no humor in it. I spent 3 years alone in this house punishing myself for losing you, and it turns out I might lose everything else besides. Then we fight for it, Elias said immediately, surprising himself with how quickly the word we had returned to his vocabulary, as though 3 years apart had never dulled the instinct at all. You're not facing a lawyer and a stranger's claim by yourself. Not this time. Julian looked at him for a long moment, something raw and searching in his expression. You'd really stay for this? For a legal fight over a barn full of half-finished chairs? I'd stay for you, Elias said simply. The barn is just where you happen to keep your heart these days. I intend on making sure nobody takes it from you. Julian folded the letter back along its worn crease and set it gently in the box, beside the will he would need to face in the weeks ahead, and something in his shoulders loosened, some old, rigid weight finally set down after 8 months of silent carrying.